Alright, welcome back. This is now part 3 of our series on ancient Rome. And fair warning, this is probably going to be the lesson that has the most named individuals. So just buckle up for that. But in our last lecture, we talked about Roman expansion during its Republican phase, how Rome comes to conquer the entire Apennine Peninsula, that would be Italy, but then also the Iberian Peninsula, what would be Spain, North Africa, Greece, even parts of Anatolia. And I had also mentioned, I'll recap this, the idea that because of this expansion, Rome has a glut of newfound wealth and wealth-making opportunities. So they have a lot more land, which means that they have a capacity to make bread, money. They have taken a lot of captives in these wars, the Punic Wars, the wars against the Macedonians and Pergamon. So they've taken a lot of captives, which means that they have a lot of slaves at this point, newfound slaves. Not that slavery was new to the Roman Empire during this portion of its history, but it does expand a lot at this point, where you wind up having a peak population of slaves. We also talked about this just cyclical dynamic throughout history. This is not unique to Rome. This is something that we could apply to, China, or we could apply to the modern period in the West. This concept that strong men create good times create weak men create bad times, and bad times create strong men. And so the times are good, or at least, there's a lot of wealth at this point, which means that the generation that had secured these resources and this land winds up giving way to a generation of decadence and opulence. A lot of this wealth is finding its way into the hands of fewer and fewer people. People who start to think of themselves as the optimates. This is not new that they think of themselves as the aristocracy or the oligarchy. But remember, in Rome you don't have kings, you don't have royals, but you do have an elevated patrician noble class, people who think of themselves as the true Romans, whereas the plebeians and other outsiders are less so than them. And so a lot of the land, a lot of the slaves, a lot of the wealth winds up finding its way into the hands of fewer and fewer people. You wind up having, these orgies, just partying and raucous drunkenness and things like this. Meanwhile, you have more and more people who think of themselves as not really benefiting, even if they've fought in the Punic Wars. Let's say if they put their life and their blood on the line, they didn't really benefit to the same extent. They were fighting for the Republic, they were fighting, for Rome, but they don't wind up with any of the wealth in their own hands. So they've contributed to this wealth expansion project, but they're not benefiting from it. In Roman society, you have these, the patrician class, and then also in Rome you have the plebeians. We've talked about them. They have some political power at this point. But then what about outside of Rome? Well, people who were ethnically and linguistically the same as the Romans, but they didn't live in the city of Rome, they were called Latins, and they had some rights, but fewer rights even than the plebeians. And then what about people who were ethnically, linguistically distinct from the Romans, but they're still on the Apennine Peninsula? These would be called the Itali people. So think of the Etruscans, the conquered Greeks down in the south, or the Celts. So they are Italian, but they're not Roman, they're not even Latin. And now you have a group of people even further out, the conquered Carthaginians, the conquered Greeks, the conquered people of Pergamon. And so you have this pyramid of society where, everybody's able to think of themselves in relation to the people who have either more or fewer rights than they do. And there's a growing amount of malcontentedness between the optimates, the elites, and the people who are called the populares, or just, think of the populace in general, the disenfranchised many. And into this sphere, we wind up having this new phrase that we still use today, which is called bread and circuses. Well, how do you keep the populares down? How do you keep them from revolting when they outnumber you, 100 or 1,000 to 1? How are you able to keep them subjugated? Especially when you don't have machine guns or tanks or the ability to mow these people down should they actively revolt against you. Well, you have to give them something to do. One, we're going to give them very cheap or even free low nutrient density food. So you give them, bread that's provided for by the government. You have a welfare program where these people are fed. Hungry people revolt, but if you can keep people full, and especially if you can keep their bellies full of something that doesn't actually sustain them, doesn't actually give them the type of energy that they would need to revolt, then they don't revolt. They don't rise up. And then this concept of circuses. The circus, we can think of the Colosseum, and just think of these gladiatorial battles or these chariot races or, essentially sporting events that are, again, sometimes these are even given for free, that anybody can show up and they can watch, this team fight against this team, or this, famous charioteer race against this other charioteer. And as long as people have something to pour their energy and their interest into, as long as they're paying attention to the sports, the blues versus the greens, for example, then their energy is not going into planning and bringing about any kind of revolution. So the bread and the circuses are keeping people down. They're keeping people low energy and giving them something to pour their energy into, what little energy they have. And that lasts for a while. But again, as more and more people find themselves with fewer and fewer of the benefits of actually living in Rome, there's still going to be a growing amount of malcontentedness. And it's into this environment that you have the introduction of two men that are called the Gaius brothers. The Gracci brothers. These are maternal grandsons of Scipio the Younger, Scipio Africanus, that we talked about, the major hero of Rome in the Punic Wars, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And they both serve as tribunes. You'll remember that the tribunes represent the plebeians, and they exist to try to speak on behalf of the people who are the poorer citizens of Rome. Remember that these people would still have more rights than the Latins outside of Rome, or the Italians who are not ethnically and linguistically Latin in the Apennine Peninsula. But Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, in turn, Tiberius first, and then his brother after him, they seek to actually help out the plebeians by giving them some of these newly acquired lands and helping them to achieve more of the rights of the patrician class, the upper class. And for their efforts, Tiberius is beaten to death with chairs by the optimates, the people who say, no, these plebs, these lower populares people, they need to be kept in their place. They don't deserve the bounty of these wars. And so he's beaten to death with a chair, and 300 of his followers are also summarily executed after him. And so his brother Gaius winds up rising up in his place, also being elected to the office of tribune and eventually consul. And he tries to formalize a lot of these reforms that his brother had tried to make, and as a result, 3,000 of his followers are killed. He actually takes his own life, so he's not technically assassinated, but 3,000 of his followers are taken down. And what this means is that there's now, the door is open for political violence inside the walls of Rome. Remember, these are not outsiders. These are not, let's say, Greeks or Celts. These are Romans. These are men who stand in the city of Rome. They hold political power in the city of Rome, and rather than just being, outvoted, they are bludgeoned to death, or they are killed or forced to kill themselves. And this door to political violence being open, it is not going to shut for quite some time. Remember, I said at the end of the last lecture that this period of time lasts for about 100 years of nearly constant civil wars. Rome will not really be able to go even a decade without there being some sort of revolt or riot or outright civil war between the optimates and the populares. And so the Senate, the patricians, the optimates, believe themselves to have put this issue to bed. But again, this is not something that's going to go away. This tension continues to exist, and it's into this environment that you have the rise of these two men who are named Sulla and Marius. Sulla here on the left is the representative of the patricians, the upper class, the optimates, the Senate, and then Marius, here on the right, he represents the plebs, he represents the populares, the people at large. And, I can talk about what the issue is that sparks this civil war between them, where they actually both have their armies and they fight against each other. But it's important to keep in mind that this war is almost inevitable, or these two civil wars that are fought between these men and their legions are almost inevitable. like if you talk about World War I, you can say, oh, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo, and you can talk about the event that sparked off the war, but the reality is that the alliances and the political environment existed as such a powder keg, as Bismarck would have put it, that all it would have taken is just any little thing would have set this war off. And the tension between the Optimates and the Populares is already at its breaking point. And the actual event that winds up leading to this war is that you have these two legions, one that is loyal to Sulla and one that is loyal to Marius, and both of these men have the desire to go into the eastern part of Anatolia and to conquer a kingdom out there that's called Pontus. They both want to be the one to go out there and to, gain glory for themselves by taking over this kingdom. And they're not willing to cede the ground to allow the other one to go and win this battle and gain this glory, and so they fight against each other. And in both of these civil wars, Sulla, the champion of the wealthy elites, winds up winning, and that means that the power of the Senate is vastly increased, and the power of the tribune, or the concilium plebis, is vastly decreased as a result of both of these wars. So again, the optimates, the upper class, the elites, the aristocracy, they have been successful in taking down Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus, and now they've also been successful in taking down Marius twice. So you have a riot, a revolt, and two actual civil wars. And in all of these conflicts, the Optimates have wound up being successful. So if we move forward, we have these three guys who wind up coming to power. This is what's called the First Triumvirate, and it is essentially like a friendship group, or just like an informal alliance between these three men. You have over here on the left Pompey, in the middle Crassus, and on the right Julius Caesar. And they all three have legions that are loyal to them. Remember, that's very important, is that we're entering into a point of Roman history where the legions do not see themselves as being loyal to Rome. Loyalty to Rome got the Italians nothing. It got the non-Roman Latins nothing as a result of fighting and winning the Punic Wars or the Macedonian War. And so instead of being loyal to Rome, these legions are largely loyal to their generals, their specific commanders, because it's like, okay, Rome might not give me anything. I can negotiate with my individual leader and ask him, okay, if I fight for you, if I'm loyal, and if we win, what can I get out of you? And Pompey has a lot of glory. He has a lot of notoriety. He's already put down revolts, and he's conquered and won battles in what today would be Israel. And then he's also been very instrumental in putting down a lot of piracy in the Mediterranean, and making the Mediterranean a safe place for shipping, for trade, where people don't really have to worry about being overtaken by pirates and having their treasure and their goods confiscated or stolen from them. Crassus has a ton of money. He's been able to raise his legion basically by cash. One of the ways that he makes his money is by, interestingly enough, he starts a fire department, or a fire rescue service, which winds up being a racketeering service, where he essentially threatens to light your property on fire unless you pay him a protection racket, a protection fee. But he's also gained some glory by himself by putting down the slave revolt. If you've ever heard of Spartacus, the slave revolt in the Roman Empire that was led by the slave Spartacus, Crassus is the one whose legion was responsible for putting that revolt down. And then you also have Julius Caesar, who comes from a relatively wealthy family, but he doesn't really have any glory for himself. He doesn't have any military accomplishments for himself at this point. What he does have, however, is he has the love of the plebs, the love of the poor. They love this guy because he is related to Marius, the champion of the masses, the champion of the man who lost those two civil wars, but nevertheless he fought for the rights of the populares, and he has his own legion, but he doesn't have any glory for himself yet, and so he sets out to take care of that. Pompey has some notoriety in his military conquests. Crassus as well has some military glory and fame that he's won for himself. And so Julius Caesar seeks to get glory for himself by going into Gaul, what today would be France, and adding Gaul to the Roman Empire. So he takes his legions, after serving as consul for a term, he is appointed as the governor in a northern Italian province, and he takes his legion and he marches his way up through France. He actually winds up landing in Britain twice, and he winds up securing a foothold in what today would be, the island of Great Britain, and circling back around and coming back down to into the Roman Empire. And as a result, he essentially commits a genocide of the Celtic people, the Gallic people. The Gauls are a subset of the Celtic people. And when we think of Celts today, when we think of these, red-headed, maybe green or blue-eyed people, we usually think of maybe Ireland or Scotland. But the Celts would have been, they would have inhabited all of the British Isles, and then also all of France. That would have also been a territory that would have been inhabited by these, red-headed, green or blue-eyed Celtic people. This particular group would have been called the Gauls. Up in Britain, they would have been called the Britons. But the Celtic people are essentially genocided throughout France by Julius Caesar and his legions. So they march up, and they add all of this land to the Roman Empire. And Caesar even writes his own, probably propagandized version of the history of these wars, the Gallic Wars. You can actually read that today, written by Julius Caesar, or at least, compiled and edited by Julius Caesar, that tells about these campaigns where they fought off the Celtic people, the Gallic people, and the Gauls, and they march back. And so now Julius Caesar has secured land and wealth, and probably most importantly of all, military fame for himself. So all of this land that, largely what we would call France today, was added to the Roman Empire by Julius Caesar. He has the loyalty of his faction, of his legions. He has gained a lot of land, a lot of wealth as a result of this. And as a result, the other two members of the Triumvirate and the Senate are getting nervous, and they tell Julius Caesar, like, hey, we noticed that you're getting very big, very rich, very powerful up there. That's great. Thank you for serving the empire. The Republic. The Republic. It's not an empire yet. We thank you for your service, but you need to disband your army and come home. And Julius Caesar refuses to disband his army. So famously, he maintains his legions that are loyal to him, and he marches over the Rubicon River. And now he has technically invaded Rome with his army. Now, Crassus at this point is actually dead. He dies in Persia, in the Parthian Empire that's a little bit further to the east, trying to add some of that land to the Roman Empire and ultimately failing. A kind of apocryphal story says that the Persians that overtake him, because of his reputation for wealth, they actually pour molten hot gold down his throat and then cut his head off. So brutal end for him. But Pompey and the Senate, they wind up moving east to Greece and setting up shop there for a while. And, because they're afraid of the fact that Julius Caesar has marched on Rome, which means that Julius Caesar is essentially alone in the city of Rome as the man with power. He's a member of the Triumvirate, but the other two members of the Triumvirate, one is dead and one is gone, and pretty much the whole Senate has fled, which means that Julius Caesar takes for himself the office of dictator, or dictator, and dictator in perpetuo, which means for life. Originally, he just takes the office of dictator, eventually expands to 10 years, and then eventually for life. But Julius Caesar exists as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and even though he's not a king in name, he's essentially a king in practice. And Pompey famously flees the Roman Empire to Ptolemaic Egypt, the last corner of the Mediterranean world that is not ruled by the Roman Empire, and therefore is not ruled by Julius Caesar himself. And the king, whose name is something like Ptolemy the 42nd or Ptolemy the 31st or whatever it is, but his name is Ptolemy. He sees Ptolemy as a refugee, as a runaway from Julius Caesar, this large and in charge ruler of the Roman Empire, and he cuts off Pompey's head and he sends it as a gift to Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is kind of outraged by this because he was planning on pardoning the members of the Senate and kind of making a show of his grace and his mercy for the Roman people. And so he is very upset at Ptolemy for doing this, and as a result, he winds up forming an alliance with Ptolemy's sister and also wife, Cleopatra. And Cleopatra winds up being a kind of an informal or an unofficial ally of Julius Caesar during this time. And so Egypt is not added to the Roman Empire yet. It's coming, but it is at least, no longer hostile toward the Roman Empire as long as Cleopatra is in charge. And Julius Caesar, like I said, he's running the Roman Empire pretty much by himself, and he does an outstanding job. So he's a dictator, and he takes his power by force, and people would say, maybe less than legitimate means, but he's also an effective ruler. Let's talk about a little bit of his reforms and what he does. One thing that he does is he does help to grant more land and more rights to the lower classes in Rome. He expands their rights, and especially he grants land to his own legion, his own army, the men who had fought for him up in the Gallic Wars. He gives them land in Gaul, that Celtic part of what today would be France. He gives them land in what used to be Carthage. He gives them land in, what used to be Macedonia or Greece. So he's granting land to these poorer people. He actually shrinks the welfare program. He makes it where the dole, D-O-L-E, which is the government issued free bread, that bread supply is decreased by about half, which means that more and more people are actually going to have to work and do productive labor, which is going to benefit the empire instead of just relying on bread and circuses. And you would think that, okay, these people are hungry, which means that they're going to revolt, but because they see themselves as being ruled by a guy who actually has their best interest at heart and who's granting them land and rights, they actually don't wind up revolting. They love Julius Caesar. Several of the cities of Italy, they throw their gates open when they hear that Julius Caesar is coming to, quote, invade, end quote, because they're enthusiastic about actually being ruled by a guy, maybe he's a dictator for life, whatever, but he's actually benefiting my life. Whereas this old Senate and even the Concilium Plebis, we can say that, oh, they're elected by the plebs or they're elected by the patricians, and, they have the legitimacy of being elected. It's like, who cares? I'm not gaining anything as a result of this system. And so the people are willing to work hard and not revolt because they see that there's an actual path forward to success for them. Julius Caesar also famously reforms the calendar. He creates a version of the calendar that's very, very close to the one that we use today. He reforms the Senate by adding a lot more members, and he adds members from these conquered provinces. Before, if you did not live in Italy, you did not get any type of representation in the government. But now, if you are one of these Roman soldiers or Latin soldiers that's been, granted land in what used to be Carthage, what used to be Gaul, what used to be Greece, these provinces have actual representation in the Senate in Rome. So the Senate is expanded, has more members, and you say, well, what does the Senate do? Isn't he a dictator? No, the Senate actually still has the ability, or the governing body of the Senate at least, has the ability to create a lot of these laws, and they might be subject to Julius Caesar, which means that if he tells them of a law that is going to be passed or not going to be passed, that they have to comply in those instances. But if you have a competent government, then they can be left alone to actually govern well. And then the last thing that he's known for is just a lot more building projects. So he builds a new forum, which would be like a town square. Think of like the Greek agora. He builds a new forum for the Roman government to function in, and just a lot more building projects that he's known for. And again, the people love him, but those senators that were living in exile, they are still furious at him because they view him as a self-appointed king. And so, in their minds, Rome is not supposed to have kings anymore. And so famously, on the Ides of March, a conspiracy of several of the senators that had been living in exile, or that had been living outside of Rome, led by Cassius and Brutus, Caesar's best friend, they return to Rome and they stab Julius Caesar to death 23 times in Pompey's theater. And So this is considered, one of the greatest acts of betrayal in all of human history. If you've ever read Dante's Inferno, Dante was a Roman Catholic, writing this kind of fan fiction about going on a tour of hell. And you had the 7 layers of hell, and at the deepest layer of hell, there's really only 3 people who are there: Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus Christ with a kiss, and sold him out to his to his captors and the men who eventually executed him, Cassius and Brutus. So Judas Iscariot, Cassius and Brutus, these 3 men are the only 3 men who accompany Satan in the lowest level of hell, where traitors dwell, or the lowest portion of that ring, the lowest portion of the lowest level of hell. And so as a result of this, you'd think, okay, maybe the Senate is going to come back into power. But again, the people, the populares, the people at large, they loved Julius Caesar. And so 3 of Julius Caesar's generals, Lepidus, Mark Antony, and Octavian, they wind up setting out to avenge the death of Julius Caesar. And Octavian is actually also Julius Caesar's nephew, but at this point, at the death of Caesar, Caesar actually bequeaths to him, or grants him in his will, his name, which means that he gains the name Caesar for himself. Eventually, we're going to call Octavian Caesar Augustus. By sheer coincidence, and one of the craziest coincidences, if you believe in those things, in all of history. At Caesar's funeral, there is a comet that becomes visible in the sky day and night for 7 days, and Octavian says that that is not a comet, that is the spirit of his adopted father and actual uncle. I don't know if I said that, but Julius Caesar formally adopts Octavian as a son. That's how he gets his name. But he says that is not a comet. That is the spirit of my uncle dad going to Mount Olympus to take his rightful place next to the gods. And so as a result of that, my father is a god, which makes me the son of God. And that is incredibly effective propaganda, especially for the ancient world. But you have these 3 generals, again, with 3 legions that are loyal to them, who wind up really putting the Senate in their place and kind of more formally taking over large swaths of the Roman Empire. So Iberia, Gaul, and northern Italy are now under the control of Octavian. Like I said, eventually he's going to change his name to Caesar Augustus. This is the faction that is beloved by the plebs, beloved by the lower class, again, because he is the son and nephew of their champion, Julius Caesar. Just like Julius Caesar had their hearts because he was related to Marius, champion of the masses. In the same way, Octavian has their loyalty here. Down in the south, in northern Africa, Lepidus has his faction. He is definitely considered the least important of this, what's called the Second Triumvirate. And then over in the eastern provinces, you have Mark Antony. He has control of Greece, of Anatolia, parts of the Levant and North Africa. And then, possibly because of his proximity, I don't know, maybe it's like a chicken and egg thing, he also winds up creating this relationship, informal and romantic, with Cleopatra. And eventually he winds up marrying Cleopatra. And so these 3 men who had been loyal to Julius Caesar, they now wind up controlling 3 legions that operate as de facto controllers of almost all of the Roman Empire. I mean, the Senate still has control of the Apennine Peninsula. It has, control of Italy. But if you are a subject of the Roman Empire, again, I keep saying empire, it's still technically a republic. But if you live in the Roman realm, let's say, unless you live in the Apennine Peninsula, you are under the direct authority of one of these 3 men. And so how much you actually love that man and how much you actually trust and want to follow that man is incredibly important. And again, these legions are not loyal to Rome. They are loyal to these 3 men, Octavian, Lepidus, and Mark Antony. And Lepidus is actually deposed pretty much by Octavian himself. Octavian walks into one of Lepidus's camps and makes a speech to Lepidus's soldiers and says, hey, basically, I need you to stand down. I need you to join me. Lepidus, I'm going to appoint you as a high priest. You can have a very cushy life in the Roman Empire. I'm not going to kill you or anything, but you need to stand down, and I am usurping the authority of North Africa. And so now you have two men who control basically all of the Roman Empire. And Octavian sails down to Egypt to try to take over, not only the eastern provinces of Rome, but also Egypt itself. And because he is such a formidable threat, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra know that they cannot overtake him, Mark Antony kills himself when he hears that Caesar is approaching, and Cleopatra famously kills herself either by, drinking a cup of poison, or perhaps, more dramatically, having one of her exotic pet snakes bite her so that she dies from the poison. As a result of this, Caesar Augustus is the de facto emperor of all of Rome, and we can say that the Roman Republic is officially dead. The body of the Senate still exists, but it has no real power outside of what the Caesar winds up commanding them to do. And Caesar Augustus does not name himself a king, importantly. He winds up taking to, because in Rome, throughout the Roman realm, there is still a distaste for the concept of a king. Instead, he takes to himself multiple different titles. He calls himself Augustus, the august one, the accomplished one. He calls himself the imperator. We can think of the word emperor, which means, the imperator is a word that your army would chant at you after you had conquered in battle, which means that he's a conqueror. He takes to himself the title of princeps. Princeps is where we get the word prince, but it just means the principal or the first among equals. And he also is given the name Caesar. So Caesar is, where later we're going to have the word Kaiser, the word Tsar. These different words for rulers come out of the titles of Caesar Augustus, this man who had been born as Octavian. And at the age of 35, he finds himself the sole ruler, the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. And he rules for 40 years, and he's a pretty effective ruler. One of the historians of the time records him as saying, "I found Rome as a city of bricks, and I left it as a city of marble." And, there's all of these architectural feats that he builds throughout the city of Rome. So the city of Rome is just peppered with all of these monuments to himself, all of these statues, all of these buildings, these beautiful buildings that he's responsible for the creation of. And you have this period of relative peace that exists inside of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, starting with the reign of Caesar Augustus. And because of this, because he is in charge for 40 years, by the time he dies at 75 years old, there are not really a lot of people in the Roman Empire who remember, they actually have a living, adult memory of what things were like back when Rome was a republic. And the ones who do, and the stories that they've heard from their parents or grandparents, is that back when we were a republic, we were constantly at war. We had riots and revolts and civil wars, and, this general would march on the city of Rome, and these other generals would depose him, and this guy was assassinated, this guy got his head cut off. And so when the Roman people think of the word republic, they think of a time of severe turmoil and upheaval and chaos. And now that there is an emperor in charge, they see the empire as a period of peace and stability and prosperity. Remember that the normal people, the populares, the lower classes of Rome, have seen their lives improve over the course of time. And so as a result of this, the republic is officially dead. Rome is officially an empire, and an empire is what it is going to continue being from this time period all the way up until its death around the year 500. So, long lesson. Like I said, a lot of individual proper names in that lesson. However, that is the story of how the Roman Republic officially transforms into the Roman Empire. We'll talk more at length about the Roman Empire in the years between Augustus and the end of the empire in our next lecture. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a blessed day.